All right, I think I'll get started. Again, welcome everyone to our first rounds of the year. I can't necessarily say I'm happy that the school year is beginning, but I am happy to be with all of you tonight. So I'm Nellie Herman. I will be your host this evening. On behalf of the Division of Narrative Medicine at Columbia University Irving Medical Center, I welcome all of you who are joining rounds for the first time, and welcome back all of you who have been with us many times. Narrative medicine arose at Columbia in 2001 and is now an international movement at the intersection of humanities, the arts, clinical practice, and healthcare justice. Narrative training equips clinicians to humbly try to comprehend their patients' experiences and perspectives so as to deliver equitable and effective healthcare. Rigorous training and practice of narrative medicine helps all those interested in person-centered, respectful healthcare to deepen their self-awareness, clinical attunement, collaborative skills, and creative capacities. Our commitments to healthcare justice underlie our writing, teaching, research, advocacy, and delivery of care. Narrative medicine community assembles monthly at rounds to grow our knowledge, partnership, and commitment to a just and effective healthcare future. So before I introduce our exciting speaker for tonight, I'm just going to mention a few basic Zoom ground rules. We're all very familiar with Zoom, I know, but just to ensure everything goes smoothly tonight, please do keep your microphone muted to cut down on any background noise during the program, and be forewarned that if there are any disruptions or inappropriate comments in the chat, you may be removed from the event. During the talk, what's going to happen is I'm going to introduce our speaker, and then she is going to talk for a little while. And then after that, I'm going to ask her some questions, and then we'll invite questions from you all. So I just ask that you keep the chat interactions to a minimum while Megan is speaking, just because it can be a bit distracting for everyone to also be watching the chat. Once I come in and two of us begin speaking, you can feel free to chime in or ask questions or whatever you want to do. Just be aware that we may not see if you put a question that you want us to answer later, we may not see it. So once I will direct you at a certain point, like, okay, now's the time to put your questions in the chat. So, I'll tell you when to do that. Before that, just know that we won't be monitoring the questions. The event is being recorded, so everyone who registered will get the link to the recording after a day or so, a day or two, and also captioning will be available during tonight's event. At the end, we'll put up a link to online bookstores where you can order Megan's books or find out more information about her and about the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics and the program in narrative medicine. All right, so I think that's all my business. So now I get to the more fun part, and I get to introduce Meghan O'Rourke. Meghan O'Rourke is a writer, poet, and editor. She's the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Invisible Kingdom, Reimagining Chronic Illness, which is what we will be speaking about today. Also the best-selling memoir, The Long Goodbye, and the poetry collections, Sun in Days, which was named a New York Times Best Poetry Book of the Year, Once, and Half-Life, which was a finalist for the Patterson Poetry Prize and Britain's Forward First Book Prize. O'Rourke is the recipient of numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Radcliffe Fellowship, a Whiting Nonfiction Award, the May Sarton Poetry Prize, the Union League Prize for Poetry from the Poetry Foundation, a Lannan Literary Fellowship, and 2 Pushcart Prizes. She is currently the editor of the Yale Review. She began her career as a fiction and nonfiction editor at the New Yorker, and since then has served as culture editor and literary critic for Slate, as well as poetry editor and advisory editor for the Paris Review. Her essays, criticism, and poems have appeared in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Slate, Poetry, the Kenyon Review, the Best American Poetry, among others. She is a graduate of Yale University, where she also now teaches. So welcome, 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 Meghan. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Nellie. That's just a beautiful introduction. And I'm slightly embarrassed to say I'm having a technical problem, which is that my mouse died as you were speaking. And so I can't actually pull up my notes. So I'm wondering if I might run and get the cord and or get my laptop.
Absolutely. Do what you got to do.
This has never happened. So my apologies, everyone. I will be right back. So thank you for, this is a new tech problem that I've never had before while doing a Zoom event, but here we are in the age of Zoom and these things happen, I suppose. Thank you, Nellie, for filling in. Let's see if I can get this. It's going to take, I don't know if this is going to work. We're going to see. But I thought at least I could start chatting with you while I try to pull this up on my, hang on one sec, and I will be with you.
We're very casual here in narrative medicine world. So
this is part of the narrative, right? This is the little bit of the chaos.
Yeah, that's right. We like to be human with one another. So
yeah. So I'm going to charges a little bit, and I don't know if it's dead or just broke. So forgive me, I'm going to be reading from another computer, but trying to look out at all of you. So thank you so much, Nellie, for that beautiful introduction, and to all of you for being here on a gorgeous night, at least in the East Coast, on your computers here with me. I am going to read a little bit, not read a little, I'm going to talk a little bit about my book, sort of reading passages from it that I've strung together into a talk for you. I'd like to keep it on the shorter side because I've been thinking about the fact that speaking at this narrative medicine program feels like sort of my dream place to speak and dream place really to be in conversation, because in a sense, the invisible kingdom is pretty much entirely about the challenge and the task of narratives and building narratives, making narratives, and crucially sharing narratives, right? I think that part of the work of the book is to make the argument that was very slow dawning on me, that when we are sick, we're not alone in a bed or in isolation telling ourselves a story or trying to build a new self that can encompass this new sickness. In fact, the experience of being ill is very much a social one. And in a sense, it's one that we are co-creating, right? We co-create narratives and then we splinter off and create different narratives depending on our identities. And one of the really key things I try to underscore in my book, and you'll hear a bit tonight, is that I think the narratives that certainly people who are chronically ill tend to tell, or certainly I told, and many of the people I spoke to told, are unstable, right? Unstable. They change. They wax, they wane, new things happen that necessitate the construction of a new narrative. A very concrete example is that I got COVID this summer, as many people have. It was my first time. And it caused or triggered a flare of many of my symptoms that had been dormant for some time. And so the questions that I take up in the book feel very, let's say, freshly urgent to me. And I just wanted to share with you all, because actually I haven't talked about this that much so far, but that it really brought home for me just how easy it is when the narratives we have when we're sick are all in our heads, how easy it is for those narratives to kind of reinforce isolation too. And that's part of why I wrote this book, was to try to create a community, create this invisible kingdom, rather than this idea of people alone suffering or living with conditions alone. So yeah, so that's a little bit about the book. Before I wrote the book, I interviewed about 90 to 100 people who were living with different chronic conditions. The book is about chronic illness, The Invisible Kingdom, Reimagining Chronic Illness. And I also interviewed many researchers, scientists, and clinicians along the way. So that's sort of the backdrop to the book. And the book comprises both my own story of getting mysteriously ill and then the research that I did in order to try to understand what was happening to me and the frameworks that contributed to my sense of loneliness in this experience. So I'll read a little bit and talk a little bit, and then we'll hopefully all talk together. So the very first thing I wrote about my own experience of getting ill was about the stories we tell about illness. So my book opens saying the stories we tell about illness usually have startling beginnings: the fall at the supermarket, the lump discovered in the abdomen, or the doctor's call. But I tend to say I got sick the way Hemingway says you go broke, gradually and then suddenly. There's different ways to tell my story and different ways I have told my story to myself. One way is to say that I got ill just after college in the late 1990s, when I began experiencing dizziness, chronic pain, and drenching night sweats, before any doctor I saw evidence of my being sick or believed that I was sick. Another way to tell my story would be to say the illness took hold in the days after my mother died on Christmas Day of 2008, when I caught a virus, a debilitating fatigue overcame me. I had a strange rash and my lymph nodes ached for months, and I slid into an exhausted fog I attributed to grief. A month later, a doctor found that I had active Epstein-Barr virus. But yet another way to tell the story would be to say it started later, in January of 2012, on a windy beach in Vietnam, where my partner and I had gone on a kind of honeymoon. We were reading by the water when I noticed another strange rash by my arm, and I thought, it looks like Braille. And I remember having this strange interior question. And I remember asking myself, but what is the message? What's the message of this rash? It was sort of on the face of it a strange question to ask. And in fact, trying to answer that question ended up leading me on a nearly 10-year quest. After that trip to Vietnam, I got sicker and sicker, and in the grips of a malaise that I had no name for and no diagnosis, and meeting with at times dismissal from doctors and clinicians, at other times deep desire to help, but limited sense of what might be wrong, right? We were all out of options. Nothing was turning up that looked obvious on my lab work. I ended up really going on this search for understanding, because I spent quite a long time being sick without anyone being able to tell me, yes, we have a test that tells us you're sick, or we know what's wrong with you. And I looked fine. So in that time, I turned to literature, science, philosophy, doctors, healers, historians, researchers, and other patients, as I've said, and interviewed many of them. And I became interested in the contradictions and complexities of our medical system and the obstacles faced by patients, in particular with those who have illnesses that are poorly understood, and really interested in the question of what might help me live with illness instead of focusing entirely on overcoming it, right? Which is our traditional narrative in America. We love to tell the story of what can't kill you makes you stronger, and just do it, right? Muscle through it. I had very much absorbed those narratives, those kind of external cultural narratives. And so during this period, as I thought about what I wanted and what might help me live with this illness, there were many answers, but one really stood out for me and for many of the people I interviewed. And that was that above all, I and we wanted recognition of the reality of our experience, not least so that others might in the future suffer less than we were. There are a lot of people living with illness, some of them suffering, some of them having made new lives that I think they might not describe as lives full of suffering. We are all familiar with the ubiquity of long-term illnesses like heart disease and cancer, right? We live with chronic illness more than ever. Those diseases tend to be well defined and viewed as unquestionably real, even if there's a lot that we clearly don't yet know about them. But the kinds of illnesses I write about in my book are what I call a silent epidemic of chronic illnesses that tend to be marginalized, contested, or even go unrecognized. Illnesses that include autoimmune diseases in which the body's immune system mistakenly turns on tissue or attacks tissue it is meant to protect, but also diseases like myalgic encephalomyelitis or chronic fatigue syndrome, which we also call MECFS, post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome or chronic Lyme disease, as many patients call it, dysautonomia, mast cell activation syndrome, fibromyalgia, and now, of course, on a scale that I think is only beginning to be recognized, and certainly the causes are only beginning to be recognized, we have long COVID. So if every age has its representative signature disease that sort of takes on cultural weight, I contend in the book that this type of chronic illness is ours, which is to say, I argue that they are conditioned collectively, culturally, in which we find pointedly reflected back at us habits of thought that reveal key cultural assumptions to us. And so, in a sense, the work of the book is to show that it's hard to be a person living with one of these conditions or living with an unknown illness without constantly contending with other people's stories about you and why you are the way you are, and those stories may or may not align with science. The illnesses I write about, of course, are very distinct from one another, but they are often characterized by dysregulation of the immune system and or the nervous system, which can be powerfully intertwined. And some researchers I interviewed suspected that there may be meaningful overlap in how some of these conditions work and in the people who have them. In other words, when I interviewed people, many had not one of these illnesses, but multiple. Right? They might have long COVID and dysautonomia, or dysautonomia might be long COVID. They might have, multiple different conditions. They are conditions that modern medicine knows surprisingly little about, and that evidence suggests can be triggered by multiple causes, including the body's response to infections, as we've now seen vividly dramatized. It's a category growing in size. To take one example, autoimmune diseases are rising at what scientists told me were epidemic rates. Many of the scientists I interviewed felt strongly that research suggested this is not just better detection, though we surely do have better detection for autoimmune diseases, that we're actually seeing and living through some real rise in the number of people who have them. Rates are hard to pin down. It's thought they now affect autoimmune diseases now affect from 24 million to 50 million people in the United States. And the pandemic, of course, has added now long COVID to this problem. So we're looking at many millions, potentially many millions more, or millions more. So the work I'm doing in the Invisible Kingdom aims to understand and perhaps reframe the ways we think about this silent epidemic, because, as I argue, we are living through what might fairly be called a kind of epidemic or shadow pandemic now with long COVID. And yet our medical understanding of such conditions lags far behind our understanding of chronic conditions like cancer. The other complicating factor here too is that some of these conditions can be highly responsive to stress and environment and what we might call biography. Certainly a condition like dysautonomia, which is a disorder of the autonomic nervous system, can be very much triggered by stress, right? Sort of your nervous system misreading or moving from like a fine dial to a very crude dial where it sees a stress and overreacts. And we're finding that in many people who have long COVID. So in the book, I talk about the ways in which these kinds of immune-mediated or infection-associated chronic illnesses can reveal to us the limits of the current structure of the medical system and the challenges that come with measurement-based medicine. I also talk about the ways in which, the pathologies what I call the pathologies that we might associate with American individualism. I talk about our discomfort with what John Keats, the poet who himself died of tuberculosis, called being in uncertainties without irritable reaching after fact. So I'm interested in this space of uncertainty and how do we live with uncertainty in an era where we are appropriately devoted to finding out facts, right? How do we negotiate what it is to live in that liminal space where we're fact finding? What kinds of narratives creep in and why? In the end, the epidemic of these illnesses is a stark reminder, I argue at least, that of our social and environmental interconnectedness. So when the poet John Donne wrote, "No man is an island," a phrase you've probably all heard, he actually wrote it while he was in bed with an infectious illness in 1623. He thought he was going to die. And he was listening to, he had a daughter who was not yet married and he was worried about her. And he said, "You've got to get married," right? And there's a pandemic around him. So the bells of the churches were ringing constantly for people who were dying. And so he's lying there thinking he's gonna die and he's listening to the bells and he thinks, one of these bells is a sign that my daughter will be taken care of after I'm dead. And he writes this incredible piece where he says, "No man is an island. We're all part of the main." And he says too, famously, ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. So I love that image of Donne, because you see in that moment the ways in which the isolation can actually be a form of connection to others, which we'll talk about. So, Donne could have been offering a framework for how we would come to think of the immune system, in a sense, as a defense system that leaves our bodies porously open to one another. Again, as the current pandemic has reminded us, right, that we'll need to take care of, during those early years, we were taking care of ourselves in order also to take care of others. So we each have our own highly personalized immune system, but it is in fact shaped by our history of interactions with others, along with pathogens, by social stressors such as poverty, trauma, race, and more. But a lot of the work in the book is trying to get at the fact that one of the hardest things about being chronically ill is that most people find what you're going through incomprehensible if they believe you are going through it. And partly that has to do with chronicity, right? And the ways in which chronicity pushes against the kinds of narrative structures that we have. Narrative structures are dynamic. They rise, they fall, there's a crisis, and then there's resolution. Chronic illness pushes against most of those kinds of story structures. So there's an incredible quote from the 19th century French writer, Alphonse Daudet, who was a novelist who had late-stage syphilis. And in an era when syphilis was poorly understood, and he left this record of fragments of him trying to understand an experience where no one could exactly tell him what was wrong or how to fix it. And he writes, and late stage syphilis, not a great disease to be living with, so lots of pain, lots of neurological problems. And he wrote in this fragmentary record that pain is always new to the sufferer, but it loses its originality for those around him, which I think is a pretty extraordinary statement of the problem of chronicity, whether it's pain or other kinds of suffering. That one of the things that's hardest to convey, and one of the things I was trying to do in this book, and as a poet as well as a journalist, was to try to create a bridge where we could imagine our way into the lives of others for a moment and realize that what to us has become normal remains freshly, profoundly destabilizing, painful, challenging for them, right? That when we live with chronic conditions, it doesn't resolve for us. It resolves for others, but it may or may not resolve for us. And any day, any given day can bring with it a new set of challenges that kind of breaks down the fragile security and structure that you have. So a question I think about a lot in the book is, how can we explain and identify what we're going through, and how can we live with illness as individuals who are also in the social sphere? We have to work, we have family. How do we convey what's going on when often few people have a grasp of what it is we're living with, especially if we are bodies at the edge, what I call the edge of medical knowledge? How do you describe a disease that's not always there? How do you describe a disease that's not yet understood? What is the work we can do together to make that experience less challenging for those who live with such diseases? I'm going to talk for a few more minutes and then we'll turn to questions. I'll talk with Nellie. But I wanted to just contextualize that my experience of feeling unwell for years, it was really a decade before I got any diagnosis. A decade when I was in my 20s and 30s, years I might like to have used in other ways, turned out to be pretty common. When I interviewed people, this was not uncommon for those I interviewed. According to the Autoimmune Association, which of course is surveilling patients with autoimmune disease specifically, it takes an average of nearly 5 years and 6 doctors for a sufferer to be given a diagnosis. I think that number has come down recently, but it's still years and multiple doctors. Because autoimmune disease can be systemic or affect multiple organs, we have a structural problem in our siloed system, and this applies also to long COVID patients and the CFS patients. People often end up consulting different specialists for different organs. And one woman I interviewed memorably told me that she just felt that doctors were crossing their organ off the list so that they could say, well, it's not really my problem. And she said at the end, there was no part of her body left, that everything had been crossed off. So there's many different factors that contribute to what I think of as the shadowiness surrounding the experience of these poorly understood illnesses, in particular, let's say autoimmune disease. So I want to just take autoimmune disease as an example, and I think a lot of what I'm going to say applies to fibromyalgia, again, long COVID, other, even things like chronic pain, although we're starting to understand that in more ways. So three things I think leapt out to me the more I thought about this as, I guess what I'm saying is a problem I spent a lot of time thinking about was why in our hyper-diagnostic age did it take so long, right? If we have this fact that so many people are finding it hard to get diagnosis, what's getting in the way of that process? And I think a lot of the answer has to do with, again, narratives, right? First is that there's no clear etiology, right? Autoimmune disease is not like the onset of a virus or an infection, even with a kind of clear-cut bacteria. It's not like a broken bone. There are many ways to end up having an autoimmune disease. Sometimes the early period of it, the effects are not discernible by lab work. The symptoms can come and go, famously relapsing and remitting. We can see symptoms in all parts of the body, or many different parts of the body, I should say. And the course can be influenced by diet and stress and environment. And finally, many people look fine, right? They're called invisible illnesses. So as a result, it's easy for a certain kind of narrative to creep in. So what's that narrative? It's the narrative of the problem with the patient is psychological. It's primarily a psychiatric problem. There's no, as I say really carefully in the introduction, the advances in mental health are one of the most important things of medicine in the 20th century. But the problem for patients with poorly understood illnesses, I want to be really clear, is that often there's a reflexive move to it's psychiatric when a first set of lab work, a first set of speaking to the patient doesn't reveal a clear answer. So 45% of autoimmune patients, according to research by the Autoimmune Association, were told early on that they were hypochondriacs. In my own research, interviewing down 90 to 100 patients, almost all of them had been referred to a psychiatrist, had suggested to them that anxiety was the real driver of their condition, or that something, psychiatric, some kind of psychiatric illness. And these were all people who ended up within 2 years with a very clear-cut diagnosis of what we call an organic disease, right? So they were in the stages of either developing or had early stage autoimmune disease or other diseases. And when lab work did not turn up clear results, they were, anxiety was often the go-to. The final thing I would say is that these conditions mainly affect women, and gender, as we know, and that's a whole separate conversation, can have a huge impact on how doctors deal with patients. If today medical science typically conceives of a disease as falling into one of three categories, these diseases kind of fall into the most complex category. So the first category would be diseases with a single identifiable cause, like smallpox or strep throat, what we call a specific disease entity. The second consists of diseases that are, colloquially we would say are all in your head. The convictions of illness known as conversion disorder or plain old hypochondria, famously embodied by Woody Allen's character in Hannah and Her Sisters, who is convinced first that he has a malignant melanoma and then that he has a brain tumor. And the third category encompasses diseases or conditions that are accepted as biologically real, but are believed to be caused or exacerbated by stress and the mind, such as panic attacks or ulcers, perhaps. And so for years, medicine has found it easiest to conceive of the first and second categories, assigning things to the measurable real disease or the psychosomatic disease best suited for a psychiatrist. And because many of the diseases flares can be exacerbated by stress, they can look to the untrained eye like a psychosomatic illness, right? But as I argue in the book, many of these diseases, like autoimmune disease, kind of fall into a third category, combining biology and biography in ways that most of us, whether scientists or lay people, remain unsure how to conceptualize. In this sense, they require us to think about illness in a more complex way than we often do. As the medical historian Charles Rosenberg asserts, there's no simple one-dimensional way to understand those entities we call autoimmune disease. And so again, often narrative creeps in, even for patients, people who are living with them. So when I interviewed people living with autoimmune disease, over and over, one of the things I heard was that they felt that something in their own life was broken or wrong or inauthentic, and that inauthenticity was manifesting in the form of an autoimmune disease in which their own immune system had turned on themselves, right? And so there was this narrative that autoimmunity is a metaphor for something inauthentic in their lives. And what interested me about this is that it's a narrative that puts all of the work on the individual, right? And none of the work on the social. And it's a very late capitalist kind of narrative, a very neoliberal narrative of, encouraging us to embark on a project of, discovering true self and authenticity and of self-improvement. And even though many of these people knew and understood that probably some of the causes for the rise of autoimmune disease have to do with environmental shifts, including changes in our microbiome, the rise in chemicals in our environment, et cetera. There's many theories. The narrative that was being told both by them and kind of in culture at large, in books and Paleo magazine, I sort of go through a list of quotes, was very much this narrative of it's your work to do, on your own. And so in the book, I have this image of people alone in their homes, their lighted windows, making one meal for their family and one meal for themselves, right? So this image of isolation rather than of social connection. So I will bring it to a close here so we can talk, but I just want to say that part of what I'm trying to get at is the ways in which being sick in this way can be a state of otherness in which you are relentlessly aware of being embodied while feeling paradoxically disembodied from your old self and from the community around you. It seemed to me no accident that from the first researchers described immunity metaphorically as a way of preserving self at the expense of non-self. Often to reckon with having any kind of illness is the question of what's yourself and what's not yourself and who's the new self. And what I found in many of my interviews was this idea of sort of being self-confused when you get sick with an illness that is not well understood. So in this way, these illnesses, in addition to being kind of a pressing medical problem, have fascinating philosophical and literary implications. Who is it who is sick? How much can we know about our own illnesses? What kinds of stories can we tell? And how can stories be reparative rather than harmful? Is autoimmunity a kind of form of the body attacking itself for the person's, psychologically inauthentic life? Or is it in fact, the consequence of an encounter of the immune system with an environment and a set of random mistakes, right? So yeah, maybe we can leave it there and talk about where we see significance in metaphor, where there may be merely accident, and what significance in metaphor do for us. Thank you so much for coming, and Nellie, I'm excited to talk with you.
Thank you so much, Megan. I am not surprised that you did such a great job bringing forward so much of what I wanted to talk to you about. This book is there's so much here, just so much. And also, as you said in the beginning, when I was reading this book, I just was like, this is, we have a whole program. This is basically like what we want to think about. So much of what you touch on in this book is literally, we have classes, trying to get people to think more about these things. So it was, anyway, I have a lot. While you were talking, I was like, okay, let me narrow this down because I have too many questions. And I think I've kind of landed just on two to ask. The first, well, I don't know even where to start. One is, well, let me start with this one. I wonder, what can we do? I told you this already, but while I was reading this book this summer, I was myself going through a medical mystery journey. And so, really just resonating so much with the book as we travel through, and feeling so frustrated in much the same way with, all the same stuff, the silos, being sent to a specialist, the specialist crosses off the organ, just what you were saying. And I'm wondering if there we have a lot of people in the audience who work in healthcare, what can we do? How much of it is a systemic issue, just the American medical system? And I myself feel so much despair when I am in a medical journey. And I wonder if there's a way to feel hope. What can we do?
Yeah, it's such a big, unanswerable, important question. And I think the first step is asking that question as precisely and beautifully as you just did, Nellie. I mean, I think we have to want to ask that question first, right? We want to have to say, there's a problem. What can we do? I first want to say, I absolutely think there's a systemic problem, and that part of the hope of the book is really not to pit the noble patient against the indifferent doctor or indifferent healthcare worker, but rather to say, how do we hear what patients and people are saying, and how do we empower and reform healthcare so that we can empower healthcare workers to, live the ethic of care that I think many of them want to live. Many of them got into this because they want to be able to pursue an ethic of care. I mean, the doctors and researchers I've met who listened have changed my life. They have been, people who go far above and beyond to give from themselves continuously, right? So I do think there's some really practical things, right? Like silos are not working for these kinds of illnesses. We need to figure out, I know Zainab, I'm going to garble her last name, and the New York Times just wrote a piece about long COVID calling for the creation of a national post-viral center. And I do think we need some kind of infection-associated chronic disease center, or centers preferably. We need to bring that model into healthcare, I think, in a really concrete way. But I think the other step is the step of that you all are doing here, which is the step of pausing and looking at narratives and the ways in which the stories we tell shape our experience and shape our expectations, right? So, how we reform healthcare, we could be here for 500 days talking about that. But I think the crucial problem I see is a problem of time and attention, right? That to really listen to people, you need time and attention. You need to have the bandwidth as a healthcare worker to be able to listen in the first place. So I think we have to start there somehow in creating that time and attention.
I think
answer, right? Like, yeah.
No, I knew it was kind of a not, anyway. By the way, if you all have questions, rather than raise your hands, what we're going to do is pull some questions out of the chat. So if you want to write your questions into the chat, that's going to be the way that you get them.
I just knocked my book down. But can I just add too, there's a great quote in the, a great comment in the chat from someone who's adding that as a physician, that these types of diagnoses and illnesses are so difficult to understand. It is deeply distressing to the doctor to not be able to diagnose or help. And I just think that's such an important point, and one that I talk about pretty explicitly in the book, that, it's confounding. And when you have 12 minutes in which to help someone, where are you supposed to begin? And there's a real emotional distress there. So I do think a very concrete thing is to start to think about, in med school even, how do we inhabit a space of uncertainty together as physician and patient? What does it mean for a physician not to have answers, and what kinds of solace or comfort can be offered? Because I think something physicians may not know is that often a kind word itself can be, it's not going to magically change everything, but a few kind words from physicians really carried me a long way.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you're so right, that would be absolutely transformational to have that, just any attention paid to that in medical school. I also wanted to say that you're at the end of your book, when you get into talking about illness narratives, and specifically saying, like, I want to tell a story that does not, I'm going to resist the sort of uplift at the end. And I'm going to tell you that, like, yeah, no, I would not, I wouldn't change this for the world. Like, yes, I would change it. I wish I had been healthy. I mean, I do think there's something redemptive in that too, and acknowledging, like, this sucks. I don't want to be this way. So anyway, I'm talking fast because I know people are going to have lots of questions for you. I just wanted to ask one more. which to do my due diligence as a creative writer, I just wondered, you know, because you're a poet, if you might for a minute talk about how being a poet meant anything in this journey for you, and whether there is any, can the arts help us, you know, like can writing help, can anyway, whatever, however you want to answer that question. I see lots of other questions coming up, so.
Yeah, I definitely think the arts and the humanities and the work of narrative medicine programs like this can help us. And I really think a lot about that quote from John Keats. That may sound very hokey, but I really do. It's from a letter he wrote to his brother. I can't remember, most of his family died of tuberculosis, so I think his brother had maybe already died of TB, which at the time no one fully understood, right? So he's faced with a poorly understood illness that's taking his brother, I think his mother too, and he himself soon would have it. And he's thinking about what makes an artist great. And that's what he's ostensibly talking about. And he says to his brother, I think what makes an artist great is this, what he calls negative capability, the ability to live in uncertainties without any irritable reaching after fact or reason. Such an interesting quote because of that idea of the irritable. Why is reaching after fact and reason irritable, right? What is it? And I think what he's really getting at is there are just things about the human condition and experience that we don't understand, and we have to inhabit nonetheless. And that becomes vividly real when you're ill, right? Or when you care for someone who's ill, whether as a clinician and healthcare worker, as a mother, as a wife, spouse, husband. So I do think that art creates that space for us to not have answers, and poetry perhaps in particular, but the humanities creates both a vessel for and a structure for I think the human impulse to solve problems is one of our noblest impulses. And that has to go hand in hand with learning how to live when we don't have the solution.
Thank you. That's very beautifully said. All right, why don't I pull some questions here, because there are lots of them. So we don't have much time. I'm looking up. So Alexander Fish asks, when considering living with illness, how can we use narrative to help those who wish not to associate with their illness? I'm thinking in terms of the role of caretaker.
So I want to make sure I understand the question. Is the idea that there's someone who's in denial about their illness, do you think? Or maybe Alexander can elaborate in this, but yeah.
Yeah, my read is sort of, oh, there, is that?
No, am I right to jump on the audio?
Please, yeah.
Okay. Good, yeah. I think there is an element of denial, but also, you know, just when identifying with an illness is in some way an attack on someone's identity, right? And so to sort of commit to living with it is a departure from the identity they may have known. But ultimately knowing in chronic illness that living with illness is sort of the way to move forward, how you can kind of maybe use tools from narrative, both as the caretaker yourself, but also, you know, for the patient themselves, to try to promote that change.
I'm so glad you asked that question, because it brings me to the second part of sort of what Nellie just asked, which is that, you know, there really is a lot of good evidence that narrativizing your experience and writing things down can be really useful and really helpful for people who feel especially out of control. And then the other thing is that I think writing narrative helps because the experience is unstable, right? Like where I was in May is such a different place from where I am today, and where I am today is so much better than where I was yesterday, right? And so when you're in this roller coaster, it can feel incredibly overwhelming and like everything is slipping through your fingers. So I think narrative is really important. I found that with people close to me, including my father, my brothers, and my partner, when I try to say to them in day-to-day moments, this is what's going on, it's hard for them to take in. And at times I've actually written them emails and said, could you write some things down to me in response? Because there's something about putting it in writing that creates that space for attention. So that's a very basic answer that I do think if you could, I do think narrative is helpful. I do think writing is helpful. I do think other modes of communicating can be really helpful for creating that space and kindness, because no one feels defensive or like they're not being heard. They are just able to shape something, I don't know if I've answered your project.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. Yeah.
The only other quick thing I'd say is that, in terms of the denial, like it's such a personal experience. And I think it's really hard for caretakers, right? Caretakers can sometimes be in a very different place than the person with the illness. And I certainly have had my share of denial at times. And so I think the mirroring that you can do and the kind of steady support and being there when the person is ready to make that move to acceptance is important, but not pushing them, Yeah.
There's a question here that actually I'm going to ask because it touches on something you didn't talk much about, but it is a big element of your book and something I wanted to ask about. So Michelle Nair asks, I would love to hear your perspective about supporting patients who are understandably desperate for answers and treatments, et cetera, and are seeking out solutions which are not evidence-based and possibly dangerous without alienating them or taking away hope. This is becoming a big challenge, especially in the field of integrative medicine. I know you have a lot of, you write a lot about alternative medicine and so all the many things that you did when you were feeling desperate. And I understand that, so much, that instinct, like, especially because you also just want to be heard, and often integrative medicine people are the people who are going to validate. So anyway,
yeah,
I'll leave you to.
Great question. I could talk with the person who asked it and with you and with all of you about it for a long time. So my perhaps, unpopular, my really honest way of thinking about this that I try to get at in the book is that my first instinct is to make space for those of us who are suffering without answers to pursue things that seem dangerous, right? Which is to say, when you really are suffering day in and out in particularly challenging ways, it becomes almost a rational decision to say, I'm going to try these different things, right? That said, it is absolutely the job of evidence-based medicine to say, you might hurt yourself doing this, right? And this is something really dangerous to you. And one thing I think about a lot in the book is the kind of well, first of all, I wonder if the conversation could be facilitated by saying, I understand, or I don't fully understand what's going on, but I do understand that you are suffering so much that you need answers and are willing to try all kinds of things. That said, it's my job to say, here are my concerns. Here's what I think is dangerous. Here's what I think, there's no evidence for. And I guess something I wish there was more conversation around, and I think it's starting to creep in a little bit in places, is, what are the things people pursue that really are dangerous versus what are the things people are pursuing that are, maybe there's no evidence for, but perhaps not harmful. I don't know. It's one of the most challenging areas, especially when there's so much active misinformation and actual kind of political propaganda around this, and that gets very messy to untangle. I myself am very much, in support of evidence-based medicine, a big believer in evidence. I want all the science there is. And as I say in the book, I did some super risky things that now I think about and I think, oh my goodness, right? But all I guess I think I can ask, or any patient can ask, is maybe just to be heard in that desperation first, before coming in with anything else, just to kind of make space for that desperation without denigrating it, right? Because none of us know what we would do when we're really suffering. Does that make sense? I think I answered that in a very, not the way I meant to, but it's so hard. Yeah.
Yeah, I know there's so much to say on that one. I think that was a great answer. Thank you. Here's another question. Elsa Asher, I love the part about finding a beginning. I wonder how you found a narrative form / structure for a story that continues because life continues, and even an understanding of the illness evolves. What was that process like for you as a writer? That was another question I wanted to ask too, in the sense of, this book took you, the illness took you many, many years. The book took you many, many years. And I was, as a reader, just so impressed, like, how did she do this? So I wonder also about the process of finding a form for this.
Yeah. So this was a really hard book to write. I think not only because I very much had the concern that I was a layperson writing about science, and really, as I think you've heard, I honor and revere science and medicine. And so I didn't, wanted to both be true to my experience and not get things massively wrong. There's a few big mistakes I'm hoping to, but the bigger problem was exactly as you say, like, how do you put something that resists narrative, resists language? Because one thing we didn't talk about too is that a lot of the symptoms that people with these conditions live with in some ways resist the language, and we don't have frameworks for: brain fog, fatigue, even pain, right? Elaine Scarry famously writes that, pain is very hard to describe. To have pain is to have certainty, to hear about pain is to have doubt, she said. Very similar, I think, for brain fog and fatigue. So I had to both find language for some of the lived experience in a day-to-day granular way, and I had to find a structure that kept the reader moving through what is essentially a very repetitive and boring illness. Let's face it. So the way I ended up thinking about it was that I had to take the reader on my own journey, which was, I think, one of, like, kind of peeling the layers of an onion, both in terms of understanding what was potentially wrong in my body, and also in terms of my own evolving grasp of what it was going to mean that things I had thought about my future were no longer true. I was not going from the seemingly mundane, like I was not going to be able to keep running, to the large existential, will I be able to have children? And what will it mean to my work life, to my ambitions, to my sense of family? So basically the structure ends up being one of learning. There's a beautiful quote from T.H. White's The Once and Future King, which is about the young King Arthur becoming king. And Merlin, who's his advisor, says to him something like, the only thing in the world for when you're sad is to learn. When the world feels full of, I forget, it's a beautiful quote, but it says, kind of terrible things and lies, and the only thing is to learn how the world works. And that's sort of the spirit of the book, right? Which is to say, here's this messy experience. I'm going to demarcate it through acquiring understanding of why I'm here in the way I'm here.
Thank you. Well, we're almost at time. I'm going to ask one more, which I think might be a good question to end on. But there are lots of beautiful questions that we're not going to get to. So thank you so much to everyone for, and this is such, we could talk about this for many, many hours. It is also just so nice to be in community talking about stuff. And actually that's connected to the question that I want to ask. This is a question from Dan Rubins. I've heard and read so many people citing The Invisible Kingdom as a text that has made them feel an unprecedented sense of community in their invisible illnesses. Have the responses you've received to the book changed anything in your own sense of identity or community?
I'm going to get a little emotional. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Nellie. Yeah, profoundly. I think especially because, as I said, I got COVID and it's been a struggle, and more painfully, my son has really struggled to recover from COVID, although he's slowly doing much, much better. And I think that having this very immediate sense that somehow not, as much as I don't want anyone else to be going through this, somehow knowing that one is not alone, and knowing that there are many voices trying to speak to these problems, and that there's so many of us want to come to solutions and want to build community, and know researchers and healthcare workers and doctors and nurses and everyone who makes medicine happen want change, that I think there's something, this is super hokey, but it really has been something I've held on to. And I guess it just goes to that very basic truth that in community we find strength. I don't know that I knew that before I got sick. I was not the most like community focused person, very much like a young solipsistic person, right? But I think that's been in a way what the book is really about, is like our lives are built out of these connections with others. Yeah. And there are so many good questions that I wish we could get to, and I was just going to encourage anyone who wants to write to me directly. My email's on my website, meghanO'Rourke.com. I love hearing from people, and I'm always happy to engage. Over time, I'm a little slow right now, but just thank you for the great questions in the chat.
And on behalf of everyone here, I want to say thank you for writing this book. It really is, obviously such a personal thing to be sharing, and then myself included, and I'm sure many other people here have felt, it's been so helpful. And, I just thank you for doing that work. Thank you for being that person out there. And yeah, I hope you'll join us in the narrative medicine community in many other ways, because you are 100%, you belong with us. So thank you, Megan, and thank you to everyone else for being here. We're going to we'll put a slide up with where you can find this book. You can find it anywhere, really. We always encourage people to not buy books from Amazon, but where'd Megan go? She's gone.
I'm still here.
You're there, but I can't see you. All right. Okay. Thank you all. Thank you for being here tonight. Thanks. We'll see you. Oh, and next month we will be hosting Dee Dee Heller. So please join us for that. She's going to be, where did I put my, she's going to be sharing insight on the early years of child psychoanalysis. So that will be really interesting. And many more great rounds to come this year. So thank you all for being here, and see you soon.